I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I am not the kind of person who sees things that aren't there. I've done solo backpacking in places where the nearest human being was 3 days of hard hiking away. I've spent nights in my car on the side of mountain roads with nothing but static on the radio and dark pressing against every window. I've done all of that without so much as a bad dream. I tell you this not because I want you to think I'm brave. I don't actually. I tell you this because what happened at that cabin in Vermont is something I need you to actually believe. And I know how the story sounds. I know where it goes. So I need you to understand who I was before it happened, so you understand what it cost me to admit that I was not okay. And that something very, very wrong was happening right outside my walls. I found the rental on a private listing. No big platform, just a handwritten description on a local classified site, which I now understand is exactly as reckless as it sounds, but at the time felt charming. Remote cabin, 1 bedroom, with stove, covered porch, 14 miles from the nearest town in the Northeast Kingdom. October. I had a week off and a specific need to be somewhere that had no memory of me. The drive up took almost 6 hours. The last 2 miles were unpaved and the car threw up rooster tails of orange mud the entire way. The place was exactly what it looked like in the photos. Small, clean enough. The wood stove worked. There was a porch that faced west and a tree line that started about 60 yards out and went all the way to Canada as far as I could tell. I unloaded the car, made a fire, ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, and fell asleep before 9. The first night was the last completely normal thing that happened. I saw him on the second morning. I was on the porch with coffee, the kind of coffee you only make on the first morning somewhere new. Too strong, too hot, tasting like intention. It was maybe 8. Still early enough that mist was sitting at the base of the trees, not moving, just settled there like it had nowhere else to be. I was watching the mist, not looking for anything in particular, just watching. He was standing at the tree line, a man, yellow rain poncho, hood up, standing completely still at the edge of the trees, facing the cabin, facing me. My first thought, and I want to be honest about this, was not fear. It was irritation. I thought he was a hiker who'd drifted off a trail, or maybe a property neighbor who'd forgotten the place was rented. I set down my coffee and raised my hand in a wave. That standard universal gesture. I see you, you see me, we're both normal people. He did not wave back. He did not move at all. I watched him for about 30 seconds, and then I went inside to put on boots so I could go over and ask if he needed directions. I was inside for maybe 2 minutes. When I came back out with my boots on, he was gone. No motion in the trees, no crackling in the brush. Nothing. Just the mist and the tree line and the silence. I stood there on the porch for a long moment, and then I went back inside and told myself, dear, trick of the light. The poncho was probably just a particularly yellow clump of leaves at the wood's edge. I had been half awake and undercaffeinated. I believed this fully enough to let it go. Now here's the part one need you to sit with, because this is where it stops being a story about a woman who saw a strange man in the woods. I didn't go back to look. I didn't walk the tree line. I made a second cup of coffee. I read for 3 hours on the couch, and I did not once look out the window in the direction I'd seen him. I think on some level that I wasn't ready to examine yet, some part of me already knew. Day 3, late afternoon. I was coming back from a hike on a trail behind the property when I stopped at the porch steps and looked out toward the trees out of pure habit. And there he was again. Same spot, same poncho, same absolute stillness. This time I had my binoculars around my neck. I'd brought them for birds. I pulled them up and found him in the lenses in about 2 seconds. Yellow poncho, hood pulled down far enough that shadow swallowed everything where a face should be. I looked for a long time, long enough to be certain of one thing. He was not looking at the tree line or the sky or anywhere else. He was facing the cabin, facing exactly where I was standing. And the way he stood, not resting, not relaxed, upright in that particular way people stand when they're making a decision. I stayed completely still until he stepped back into the trees. 1 step and he was gone, swallowed by pines so fast it was like a lamp switching off. I called the property owner that night, described it exactly. She said she didn't know who I could be describing. She said there were no neighbors within miles. She said I could leave if I was uncomfortable. I thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while thinking about the word uncomfortable and how it was not remotely the right word for what I was feeling. That night I locked the deadbolt and the chain, propped a chair under the door handle, and slept with a hunting knife from the kitchen on the nightstand beside me. Not because I thought I needed it, because it felt like doing something. And doing something was the only thing standing between me and the specific, freezing kind of panic I was working very hard not to look directly at. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't leave. And I've thought about that a lot since. Why I didn't leave. The most honest answer I can give you is that leaving would have meant admitting that I was scared. And I wasn't ready to do that. So I stayed. And the cabin stayed quiet. And I almost talked myself out of the whole thing. I woke up the next morning at 5:30. Still dark. I don't know what woke me. No sound. No sudden noise. Just a pull. The way you sometimes wake up with the absolute wordless certainty that something has changed. I lay in bed for a minute, completely still. Then I got up and went to the bedroom window. The porch boards had a skim of frost on them. The kind of thin, perfect frost that records everything. And pressed into that frost, coming from the left side of the porch, moving across the front of the main window, and going back the way they came, were boot prints. Large, deep. The prints of someone who had been standing still for a while, weight settled in. Someone had been at my window in the night. Not passing. Standing. What happened in my body in that moment is hard to explain cleanly. It wasn't panic exactly. It was more like something cold and very heavy dropping into my chest and staying there. I stood in the bedroom doorway and I looked at those prints for a long time without moving. And then I made myself go through the entire cabin. Every window. I need you to understand what I found. At the main front window, boot prints in the frost, pressed close enough to the glass that whoever left them could have put their mouth against it. At the kitchen window, fresh mud in the flower bed below the sill. Boot-shaped impressions, both feet, side by side, facing in. At the bathroom window, small, high up, I had thought of it as essentially inaccessible, the same. Prints in the soft ground, facing the glass. At the bedroom window, my window, the window I had slept 3 feet away from for 4 nights. The deepest prints of all. Weight fully settled. He had stood there long enough to sink into the earth. Long enough to be comfortable. He hadn't been watching from the tree line. That was never what was happening. The tree line was where he stood during the day, where he let himself be seen. At night, he came to the cabin. He walked the full perimeter. He stopped at every window. And he had been doing this every single night. For nights, I had been sleeping, actually sleeping, while he stood outside my window in the dark and looked in at my face. I was in my car and moving before I'd finished thinking the thought. I threw my bag in, threw the food in on top of it, didn't go back for anything I'd left behind, and I have never once regretted what I left. I drove the 14 miles of dirt road at a speed that was genuinely reckless, and I didn't breathe normally until I hit pavement. I called the property owner from a gas station 40 minutes away. She said she'd look into it. I called back 2 days later and she didn't answer. I've never heard from her again. The police report went nowhere. No person found, no evidence of trespass they could use, no surveillance, no neighbors to interview. They were not unkind about it. They just had nothing. What I think about, not every night anymore, but enough, is the window. The bedroom window specifically. The depth of those prints. I was sleeping 6 feet away. Curtains open because I'd opened them to watch the stars the first night and never closed them again. For nights, he could see everything. He knew the layout of the room, which side of the bed I slept on, how I looked when I was completely unguarded and unconscious and had no idea in the world that I was being watched. I don't know what he was waiting for. I don't know if he was working up to something or if the watching was the point. I don't know if he's still up there, circling that cabin every night, or if he follows renters when they leave. I've thought about that last one more than I'd like to admit. I lock my windows now. Every night, every window, even in summer. My partner thinks it's a quirk. I've never explained why. Some things you carry quietly because saying them out loud just makes them more real, and they're already real enough. They're already real enough. The thing about denial is that it doesn't feel like denial when you're inside it. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like being the kind of person who doesn't make a big deal out of nothing, who doesn't catastrophize, who keeps a level head. That's what I told myself the entire first night in that cabin. I was keeping a level head. I was being reasonable. I was absolutely not pretending that I hadn't seen the door. We got there on a Thursday. Long weekend rental, lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota. Booked months in advance as a kind of anniversary gift to ourselves. 2 years since we'd taken any real time off. 2 years of early mornings and skipped dinners and falling asleep on the couch still half-dressed. We needed it badly. The cabin was beautiful in the way that old, well-made things are beautiful. Knotty pine walls so dark they were almost amber. A stone fireplace that ran floor to ceiling. A dock that extended out over black water. When we pulled up and got out of the car and stood there in the late afternoon light, the first thing I felt was relief. Pure, clean relief. I didn't want anything to be wrong with that place. I want to be transparent about that because I think it matters. I was so prepared to love it that I made certain choices about what to see and what not to see. The hallway was short. 3 doors off it, bathroom to the left, bedroom to the right, and then at the very end, a 4th door. Plain wood, old hinges, no handle. Just a keyhole, dark and deep, like a little eye looking back at you. The first time I walked down that hallway with an armful of bags, I stopped and stared at it for a moment. There was something about the way it sat at the end of the hall that bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. It didn't look like a closet door. It looked like a room door. It looked like something behind it had a lot of space to move around in. Then I put the bags down and went to open a bottle of wine. We ate on the dock that first night. The water was flat and dark, and the stars were extraordinary, and everything was exactly what we'd needed it to be. I didn't bring up the door. Neither did she. This, I would later understand, was not a coincidence. We had both noticed it, both felt the same low, uncomfortable frequency coming off it, and we had both independently decided that the nice thing to do for each other, for the trip, for the 2 years of hard work we were trying to celebrate, was to not mention it. We would enjoy ourselves. We would not make a big deal out of a door. That was day 1. On day 2, she was the one who finally said it. We were sitting on the dock in the afternoon, watching a loon make slow circles on the water, and she said, "What do you think that extra door is?" Casual, like she was asking about the weather. And I said, "Probably storage," and she said, "Probably," and the loon dove, and we watched the water close over where it had been. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the afternoon, but I thought about it. And what I thought about specifically was the listing photos I'd scrolled through dozens of times before booking. I pulled them up on my phone that evening. A 2-bedroom cabin with 1 bath. I went through every photo carefully. The hallway appeared in 2 of them, shot from different angles. In both photos, the hallway ended at the bedroom door. There was no 4th door. Not in the photos. Not on the floor plan. I texted the property manager and asked about it. She took 4 hours to respond. When she did, she wrote, "There's no extra door in the hallway. It's a 2-bedroom cabin with 1 bath. You might be thinking of the linen closet near the entrance. The linen closet near the entrance was open-slatted, white-painted, full of folded towels. I could see it from where I was sitting. This was not that." I didn't respond. I put my phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment in the kitchen. Through the window, I could see her on the dock, still watching the water. I made a decision then, a quiet, private decision, that I was not going to let this ruin the trip. Whatever the door was, it was locked. Whatever the property manager's reasons were for pretending it didn't exist, they didn't have to be my reasons. The door was locked. We were fine. I walked down the hall to the bedroom and I stopped in front of it. No handle, so I pushed first, then pressed my fingers into the gap at the frame and pulled. Nothing. Sealed or locked from the inside, I couldn't tell which. I knocked twice, 2 flat knocks, and the sound they made unsettled me in a way that was hard to name. Too close, too dense. The knock of something with almost no airspace on the other side, or the knock of a space so large it swallows sound entirely. Couldn't tell which. I still don't know which. I went to bed that night and told myself it was fine. I almost believed it. The second night was when the smell started. I got up around 2 to use the bathroom, and when I came back I slowed down as I passed the door and stopped. The air near it was different. Colder by several degrees, not a draft cold, not a window seal cold, but a cold that had weight to it, the kind of cold that comes from something large and still. And underneath the cold there was a smell. I stood there trying to identify it. Sweet, not flowers, not anything clean. Something organic. Something that had crossed from ripe to wrong. The smell of fruit left out too long, syrupy and heavy, with something underneath it that was the smell of earth after heavy rain, dark and wet and very old. I put my hand flat against the wood, and I felt it, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, almost, but not quite. A vibration, the slow, barely there shift of something redistributing its weight on the other side of the door. Not mechanical, not the house settling, the particular tremor of something living, adjusting itself in the dark. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. Here is what I have never said out loud to anyone, not even to her. I stood at that door for a long time that night, longer than I've admitted, and the whole time I stood there, some part of me, not the reasonable, level-headed part, but something lower and older than that, was absolutely certain that whatever was on the other side of that door knew I was standing there. That it had known from the moment I first walked down that hallway. That the stillness on the other side wasn't absence. It was patience. The specific, practiced patience of something that has been waiting in the dark for so long that waiting has become its natural state. I have never told her I felt that. I don't think I ever will. The third night we woke up at the same time. No alarm, no noise. Just both of us, eyes open, staring at the ceiling at once. She grabbed my arm before I was fully conscious. I felt her fingers tighten and I heard her exhale. That sharp, quiet sound she makes when something takes her by surprise. I followed her eyes to the doorway down the hallway. The door was open, not thrown open, not slammed against the wall. Open the way a door opens when someone pushes it slowly and with intention and then simply lets it hang. Open maybe halfway. The darkness inside it was total. No window behind it. No light source. Nothing. Just a rectangle of absolute black in the middle of our hallway. And the smell that had been faint and close the night before was now everywhere in the cabin. Sweet and heavy and wrong, sitting in the back of the throat, sitting behind the eyes. Neither of us moved. I don't know how long we lay there. Long enough that the quality of the silence changed, became something we were both actively enduring rather than just experiencing. I kept waiting for something to come through the door. I kept waiting for a shape in the darkness. Nothing came. Nothing moved. Eventually I got up. I turned on every light in the cabin in a specific order: bedroom, hallway, kitchen, living room, and then I stood in the kitchen with my back against the counter and I did not look down the hallway again. She came out and sat at the kitchen table. We didn't talk. We made coffee. We sat there together until the light outside changed from black to blue to gray, and then we packed our bags. We left before 7. I did not go back down the hallway. I've done some research since. Property records, mostly. The land the cabin sits on has had structures on it since the early 1900s. The current cabin was built in the late 70s, new construction, different footprint. But the foundation it sits on is older. Much older. The original structure was demolished, but the foundation was never removed. They built over it. I don't know what the original structure was. I can't find a record of what it was used for or why it was torn down. I've hit dead ends every direction I've tried to go. What I keep coming back to is simple. Not the smell, not the vibration, not even the feeling of being known through a locked door. What I keep coming back to is this. That door was locked for every day and night of our stay except for one. We were there for 3 nights. On the 3rd night, it opened. We never touched it. We never unlocked it. Neither of us went near it after that 2nd night. Something on the other side opened it. Something on the other side decided that the time for staying behind the door was over. And whatever it was, it didn't come through while we were watching. It waited until we left. I think about that a lot. The possibility that it's still in that cabin. That it moved back through the door at some point and pulled it shut behind it. That some other couple is walking down that hallway right now for the first time, stopping at the end, feeling that low and formless unease and deciding, because they want the trip to be good, because they've worked hard and they deserve good things, to not make a big deal out of a door. I want to tell them, make a big deal out of the door. Leave before the 3rd night. I can't tell them that. I don't know who they are. And by the time they understand what I mean, it's already going to be too late. Grief does something to your perception of space. That's the only way I know how to explain the first part of this, the part before things got strange. When someone you love dies, the places they occupy don't feel empty. They feel full of the wrong kind of air. Heavy, pressurized, like the room is holding its breath, waiting for a person who isn't coming back. I drove up to that cabin in April expecting exactly that feeling. What I didn't expect was for something to answer it. He died in February. Sudden, which people keep saying like it's a comfort. Like sudden is better than slow. I don't think it's better. I think sudden just means you never got to prepare, never got to say the things you were saving for later, never got the chance to sit with him one last time in the way you would have if you'd known it was the last time. He was 71, and he had been going to that hunting cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan every fall since before I was born. He built it himself in 1968 with timber cut from the property. 40 acres of dense pine, a creek that ran along the eastern edge, a wood stove that he'd replaced twice but always with the same model because he was that kind of man. Specific, faithful to things that worked. I went up in April because I thought it would help. I told myself I was going to spend a week surrounded by his things and let myself feel whatever I needed to feel. His hunting vest was still on the hook by the door. A half-empty bottle of bourbon sat on the shelf above the sink, his brand, the same one for 40 years. There was a coffee mug with a chip in the rim that I remembered from when I was small. I used to ask to drink from it because I thought the chip made it special, made it different from other mugs, and he'd let me even though it was his favorite. I found it in the cabinet and I held it for a long time standing in the kitchen, and I cried, and then I made coffee and drank it from that mug, and for a few hours everything felt exactly like what I'd hoped it would be. Sad in the clean way. Sad in the way that moves through you instead of sitting in you. The first 2 nights were quiet. I hiked during the days and came back and made fires and read books he'd left on the shelf. Battered paperback westerns, a field guide to Michigan birds with his handwriting in the margins, notes about which species he'd seen and where. I felt close to him. That was all I'd wanted. To feel close to him one more time in a place that was completely his. The third night it started. It was just after midnight. I'd been almost asleep, that heavy half-conscious place where sounds start folding into dreams, when I heard it. My name, from outside, from the direction of the creek, carried through the trees with a clarity that had no business being that clear at that distance. Not a shout, a call, the specific cadence of someone calling you from across a yard, patient, familiar, certain you'd hear it. I sat up so fast the book fell off my chest and hit the floor, and I sat there in the dark with my heart going and my whole body prickling, and I told myself, wind, trees, the half-dreaming brain filling in shapes and voices the way it does. I lay back down. I stared at the ceiling. Then it came again. My name. His voice. And here is the thing I have to be honest about, the thing that makes this harder to tell than it sounds. It wasn't just that it sounded like him. It was that it sounded exactly like him in a way that I didn't know was possible to replicate. The specific flatness of his vowels, that Upper Peninsula accent that had softened over the decades but never fully left. The way he weighted the second syllable of my name just slightly more than the first. A rhythm so particular to him that I had never heard it from anyone else in my life. It sounded like him the way his handwriting looked like him. Unmistakable. Personal. I got up. I crossed the cabin to the door. I put my hand on the handle. And I stood there. What stopped me was not a thought. It wasn't a rational calculation about the likelihood of my dead grandfather calling my name from the woods at midnight. It was something lower than thought, something in the body, in the gut, the ancient part of the brain that doesn't have language but has instinct. Something that said, do not open this door. Do not go toward that voice. Whatever is using that voice, it is not him. And it knows your name. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the cold metal of the handle. The voice came twice more. Same cadence. Same patience. The patience of something that had all the time it needed and knew, with complete certainty, that what it was calling would eventually come. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like absence, it feels like held breath. Like something withdrawing not because it's gone but because it's decided to wait. I did not sleep again that night. I want to tell you I went home the next morning. I didn't I told myself, and I know how this sounds, that I'd imagined it. That grief and isolation and sleeping in a dead man's cabin at midnight was exactly the kind of thing that would make a person's mind do strange things. I convinced myself enough to stay another day. I hiked, ate. I did not let myself think about it too carefully. I was doing that thing people do where you keep yourself busy enough that the fear doesn't have time to become real. That evening I called home, spoke to my mother. We talked for a while about ordinary things, how the cabin looked, whether the creek was still running high, whether I'd found his old fishing gear. And then, because I needed to tell someone, because carrying it alone had made it heavier than I could manage, I told her what I'd heard. I described it carefully, the voice, the timing, the specific way it said my name. I kept my tone neutral. I was trying to give her the information and let her be the one to call it grief, to call it an overactive imagination, to give me the rational explanation I was waiting for. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I said her name and she said she was there. Then she said, "He never called anyone by name. Not once in his life. Not me. Not your father. Not you. He thought it was bad luck. His mother had told him that when you call a person by name in the dark, you're telling the wrong things where to find them. He believed that. He took it seriously. He never called anyone by name. Not outdoors, not after dark. Not ever." I stood in the cabin with the phone pressed against my ear and I let that land. Really land. Because what it meant, what it could only mean, was that whatever had been standing in the trees outside that cabin using his voice had known my name before I arrived. It had my name ready. It had studied enough about me to know how to sound like him, how to replicate that specific cadence, how to make me stand up in the dark and cross the room and put my hand on the door. But it had not done its research carefully enough. It didn't know that he never called people by name. It didn't know because that was the kind of detail you'd only know if you'd actually lived close to him for a long time. Close enough to notice the things he never did. Whatever it was, it knew about me. It did not know him. I left the next morning. I packed slowly because I didn't want it to look like fleeing, and then I understood that was ridiculous. I was alone and whatever had been in the trees didn't care how my packing looked. So I packed fast and I left and I drove 3 hours south before I stopped for gas and let myself breathe normally. I've thought about what it was. I've gone back and forth across every explanation I know how to construct, and none of them satisfies me completely. I've thought about infrasound and auditory hallucinations and the documented psychological effects of acute grief. I've thought about those things seriously and with genuine effort because I would very much prefer one of them to be true. None of them accounts for the name. None of them accounts for the specific weight he put on that second syllable, a weight so particular that it lived in my body as memory, the way a smell can bring a room back or a song can bring a year back. That weight was his, only his, and something in the dark outside that cabin had it ready. The last thing I'll say is this. I've been back once since, in the fall, with family, a group of 6 people in daylight and noise and company. We had a good day. Nothing happened. Walking back to the cars at dusk, I stopped at the tree line where I thought I'd heard it and I stood there and looked into the pines. Just looked. Trying to feel something, trying to know something. The trees were quiet. The creek was running somewhere behind them. The light was going. I don't know if it was there. I don't know if it's ever not there. I don't know if it was waiting for me specifically or if I just happened to be the person who came to that cabin in that season with that much grief sitting open in them, like a frequency it could tune itself to. I think about the door. I think about my hand on the handle. I think about how close I came to opening it and walking toward a voice that had my name in its mouth but nothing of him in its intentions. I go back and forth on whether not opening it was the smart thing or just the lucky thing. I haven't decided yet. I'm not sure it matters. I need you to understand something before I start. My brother and I are not imaginative people. I say that without embarrassment. It's just true. We grew up in a household where you fixed things instead of talking about them, and you didn't make a fuss, and you especially did not sit around inventing problems that weren't there. We've been hunting since we were 12 years old. 12. That's over 2 decades of early mornings and cold blinds and learning to read the woods the way some people read books. We know what's out there. We know what things look like and sound like and how they move. That knowledge is the whole point of what I'm about to tell you, because what we saw that week in Wisconsin was not something either of us had any framework for. And we tried. We really tried to find one. The cabin was in central Wisconsin, about 40 minutes from anything you'd call a town. We'd been going there every November for 6 years running. Same place, same week, same routine. Pull in on a Friday afternoon, unpack, make a fire, eat something bad for us, get to bed early so we could be up before dawn. It was the 1 week a year we both fully exhaled. No phones, no obligations, just cold air and timber and the specific kind of quiet that only exists when you're somewhere genuinely far from everything. We loved that place. Past tense. We haven't been back. The first morning was normal. Up before 4, out in the dark, the whole thing. We came back empty-handed but not bothered. First morning rarely produces anything. Made breakfast, split some wood, did the easy domestic rhythms of a hunting cabin in November. Everything was exactly what it should have been. I want to be clear about that because I need you to understand that what happened didn't start dramatically. Started small. It started with deer that were standing still. My brother noticed them first. He was at the window before I'd finished my coffee, just looking out at the field that ran along the south side of the cabin. Maybe 40 yards of open ground before the tree line started. He said quietly, not alarmed, just observational. There's something off about those deer. I came to look. 3 of them, standing at the field's edge, right where the grass met the first row of trees. Not grazing, just standing, facing the cabin. Now look, deer do strange things. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows this. They freeze, they stare, they hold a position for longer than seems reasonable. We watched them for 10 minutes and they hadn't moved, and I said they'd probably scented us through the window and were deciding whether to bolt. That's normal deer behavior. That's the thing that happens. We went back to our breakfast. An hour later we looked again. Same 3 deer. Same spots. They had not moved in any way that was detectable. Not a step, not a turn of the head, not the flick of an ear. Just standing there in the cold with their faces toward the cabin like they were waiting for something. We went outside and made noise. I want to emphasize how much noise. We're talking shouting, hand clapping, a metal pot hit with a spoon. The kind of commotion that sends deer crashing through underbrush for a quarter mile in every direction. They turned their heads toward us. Slowly. Together, all 3 at once, like the movement was coordinated. They looked at us for a moment. Then they turned back toward the cabin and stood there. We went back inside and didn't say much for the rest of the afternoon. That was day 1. Here's the thing about day 2 that I haven't told many people. During the day, nothing. Totally normal. We hunted in the morning, came back, ate lunch. The field was empty. The tree line was just a tree line. We started to relax, started making jokes about it. Deer having a bad day, deer holding a grudge, the usual nonsense you tell yourself when something has gotten under your skin and you don't want to admit it. We went to bed in a decent mood. My brother woke me up at 2 in the morning. He grabbed my shoulder and said, quietly, too quietly for someone who'd just woken up from a dead sleep, "Get the scope." Not panicked. The opposite of panicked. The voice of someone who is keeping themselves very carefully controlled because the alternative is not something they can afford right now. I've heard that voice from him exactly once before in my life, and it was a situation I will not get into here. When he uses that voice, you move. I got the scope. We went to the window. There were 7 of them now. 7, at the field's edge, in the dark, all facing the cabin. No sound, no movement, just standing in the tree-line shadow like they'd been placed there. My brother took the scope first and was quiet for a long time, and then he handed it to me without saying anything, and the not saying anything, that was when my stomach dropped. Because my brother always says something. I put the scope to my eye and found the group and started scanning, and then I found one close enough to get a clean look at, and I stopped. The eyes were wrong. Too high on the skull. Set too far apart. Not the wide, gentle placement of a deer's eyes, but something wider. Something that implied a face with different proportions underneath the skull, longer, flatter, like the face of something that had arranged itself into an approximation of a deer from the outside without fully understanding the geometry of it. I moved the scope to the next one. Same thing. I moved it to the one on the far left, and this one I stayed on longest because something about the way it was standing kept pulling at me, and it took me a full 30 seconds to understand what I was seeing. The back legs. The joints. The angle they made when they met the ground. Deer legs bend in a specific way. Any hunter knows this. It's one of the first things you learn, the articulation of the hock, the way the leg loads and releases. These were bent wrong. Not broken wrong. Engineered wrong. Like something had studied the mechanics and gotten it 90% right and then put the remaining 10% in the wrong place. It was standing. It was bearing weight. But the angles were off in a way that made looking at it feel like looking at a word you've read so many times it stops looking like a real word. Something had gone wrong in the translation between what it was and what it was pretending to be. I put the scope down. I looked at my brother. He was already looking at me. We locked the cabin door. We checked every window. We did not go back to the window after that, and we did not sleep, and we did not talk much. There was not a lot to say. What do you say? We were two grown men who had spent half our lives in the woods, and we had just looked at something in a field that we could not name and could not explain and could not make fit into any category either of us had. So we sat there in the kitchen with the lights on, and we waited for it to get light outside, and that's what we did until morning. When the sun came up, we looked out. The field was empty. Whatever had been standing there in the dark was gone. No tracks in the frost at the field's edge. And there should have been tracks. 7 of them standing there for hours should have left something. There was nothing. Just cold ground and the tree line and the pale November light. We packed that day. Neither of us suggested staying. Neither of us suggested that maybe we'd imagined it or that there was a rational explanation we hadn't thought of yet. We just packed and drove out, and when we hit the highway and got our phones back, we still didn't talk about it much. We talked around it a little. We agreed it was real. That was as far as we got. It's been 3 years. I've looked things up. I'm not going to pretend I haven't. There are names for things like this in certain circles, certain corners of the internet where people collect stories that don't fit. I've read things that felt closer to what we saw than anything in the mainstream. I'm not going to say what those names are because I don't fully believe them, and I don't want to put a label on something just because having a label makes it feel more manageable. What I saw was what I saw. The eyes too high. The legs at the wrong angle. 7 of them standing in the dark with their faces aimed at the window like a question we'd never be brave enough to answer. Here's the part one keep coming back to though. 7 of them. And we only looked at 3 of them through the scope before we stopped. We looked at 3 and then we put the scope down and locked the door. I've thought about that a lot since. I've thought about what the other 4 looked like. I've thought about whether they were all the same wrongness, or whether some of them were worse. Whether the reason my brother handed the scope to me without speaking was because he'd already seen one of the other 4 and decided I didn't need to know. I've never asked him. He's never offered. Some questions you leave alone. Not because you can't handle the answer, but because certain answers are the kind that take up permanent residence, and you only have so much room, and some of that room you need for other things. Sleep, for instance. You need some of that room for sleep. I found it on the second day, and I want to be honest about the fact that finding it felt like a good thing at the time. That's the part that gets me. Not the fear. I've made a kind of peace with the fear. What I haven't made peace with is how normal it felt to pick it up. How genuinely pleasant the first 20 minutes of reading it were. How completely unsuspecting I was while something that knew exactly what it was doing had already set everything in motion. The cabin was in the Ozarks. Solo trip, 5 days, no particular agenda beyond getting somewhere that didn't have a single obligation attached to it. I'd driven down on a Sunday, unpacked slowly, walked the property in the late afternoon light. Creek behind the tree line, a fire pit ringed with river stones, a porch that faced east toward the hills. It was the kind of place that does exactly what it advertises. Quiet, old. The smell of pine and dry wood and cold mornings built into the walls. I made dinner, read for a while, went to bed satisfied. The second morning I was walking barefoot across the main room and one of the floorboards rocked under my foot. That specific hollow give of a board that's worked itself loose from its nail over years of temperature change. I crouched down and lifted it the way you do, half curious, half expecting nothing interesting. Dead insulation, maybe. A mouse nest. The kind of domestic archaeology that yields nothing worth finding. Instead, there was a notebook. Black and white composition cover, the kind you buy in bulk for school. Maybe 2/3 full of handwriting in several different hands. I turned it over, looked at the back, looked at the front again. Then I took it to the couch and opened it with my coffee. It was a guest journal. People who'd stayed at the cabin over the years had left entries. Names, dates, what they'd done, what they'd thought of the place. The earliest entry was about 6 years back, written in loopy optimistic cursive by what sounded like a family of 4. They'd caught fish and made s'mores, and the kids had seen a fox. The second entry was a couple who'd gotten engaged on the porch and spent 3 days in what I can only describe as written euphoria. I read through a dozen entries smiling. It was charming, the kind of thing that makes a place feel inhabited in a good way, layered with other people's happiness. I put it down to make breakfast and thought nothing of it. I picked it back up that evening and kept reading. The entries got more recent. Handwriting changed, voices changed. A solo traveler who seemed to have done some serious thinking in those 5 days. A group of college friends who mentioned a lot of wine and very little sleep. A retired couple celebrating something they kept referring to only as the anniversary of a good decision. All of it ordinary. All of it warm. And then I slowed down. It wasn't a dramatic moment. That's the thing about this story that I find hardest to explain to people. There was no single sentence that made alarm bells go off. It was gradual, the way your eyes adjust to a room getting darker, 1 degree at a time, until you suddenly realize you've been sitting in the near dark for 20 minutes without noticing. An entry, maybe 30 pages from the back, dated 8 months prior. It started like all the others. Long drive, beautiful location, weather was good. The writer described their first evening with the same warm particularity that everyone else had used. And then, halfway down the second page, the drive had been on a Sunday. They'd arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin faced east toward the hills and smelled like pine. I read that sentence again. I set the notebook on my knee and looked at the window and thought about it for a moment. Then I picked it up and kept reading. The next paragraph described a solo traveler. Practical clothes, dark jacket, looked like someone who'd packed for function over appearance. Drove something small and sensible, parked it crooked near the fire pit. My jacket is dark. My car is small. I'd parked it crooked because the ground near the fire pit dipped on one side and I hadn't bothered to straighten it. The notebook was still in my hands. I was very aware of the weight of it. I kept reading. The entry described the second morning. A loose floorboard near the fireplace. Someone lifting it and finding something. Someone taking that something to the couch. I stood up. The notebook was still open in my hands, and I stood up from the couch fast enough that my coffee mug rocked on the table beside me, and I had to catch it and set it down, and I stood there in the middle of the room holding a notebook that was describing me finding a notebook. The recursion of it hit me somewhere in the chest. Not quite fear yet. Not the clean, sharp thing fear becomes later, but something more like vertigo. The feeling of a step that's shorter than you expected it to be. I turned pages, looking for where it ended. Looking for the last entry from this particular hand, this particular voice, trying to find the edge of what had been written about me. The entries continued. My second evening, what I'd made for dinner, the light I'd left on when I went to bed, the dark fleece I'd been wearing since I arrived, the one with the small worn patch on the right elbow from years of leaning on desks. I looked down at my elbow. The worn patch was right there. Someone had described my elbow before I'd walked through that door. I was flipping faster now, not reading full sentences anymore, just scanning for the end of the entries, for the white space that would tell me where the writing stopped. The handwriting stayed consistent, the same careful, unhurried script, like someone writing with all the time in the world. I found the last entry, turned to it and read it. The date on it was tomorrow. It said this: by the time you read this, you will have spent 2 days here. You will have found the board on the second morning the way I knew you would. You will have read through and thought it was charming and put it down and come back to it in the evening, which is also what I knew you would do. I want you to know that I have been watching you since you arrived. I want you to have a full night to understand that you are completely alone out here, and that there is no one within reach, and that I have been very close this whole time. I wanted you to find this when there was still enough night left for the knowing to really settle in. I was in my car before I finished reading it. I did not pack. I did not get my bag from the bedroom or my charger from the outlet or my good boots from beside the door. I picked up my keys from the counter and I walked out and I got in the car and I locked the doors and I sat there for 3 full seconds doing nothing because my hands were shaking badly enough that I wasn't sure I could put the key in the ignition. Then I got the key in and I drove. 40 minutes of dark country road. Not enough cell signal for the first 20 minutes to call anyone. Just me and the headlights and the absolute silence of knowing I was out there alone with whatever knew I was coming. The police went to the cabin the next morning. They were thorough. They looked at the notebook. They walked the property. They found nothing, no sign of entry, no evidence of anyone having been on the grounds, no cameras anywhere on the structure. One of them told me, not unkindly, that it was possible someone had left the notebook as a prank, written it ahead of time based on a generic description and counted on the reader to fill in the matching details themselves. Confirmation bias, he said. We notice the things that match and discount the things that don't. I asked him about the elbow, the worn patch on the right elbow of a dark fleece that I'd owned for 4 years and hadn't listed anywhere, hadn't photographed, hadn't described to anyone before that trip. I asked him how confirmation bias accounted for a specific detail about a specific piece of clothing on a person whose existence the writer couldn't have known about until I booked, and who I'd booked with only a first name and a card number. He didn't have an answer for that. He wrote something in his notepad and told me they'd follow up. They didn't follow up. I've thought about this from every direction I know how to approach a problem. I've thought about it more than I've thought about almost anything else in the last 2 years. The logistics of it. The timeline. To write those entries before I arrived. Someone would have needed to know I was coming, know what I looked like, know what I'd be wearing, know how I moved through a space, know I'd find the board on the second morning and take the notebook to the couch. They would have needed to know enough about me specifically that they could write me into a story before I walked into it. And then leave a date at the end. Tomorrow. Meaning they knew when I'd find it. Meaning the whole thing was calibrated to that specific night, that specific amount of darkness left before morning, the knowing settling in exactly the way they'd written it would. I don't go to rental cabins anymore. I don't go anywhere I haven't vetted thoroughly, stayed before, or gone with other people who know where I am at every moment. My friends think it's anxiety. I let them think that. It's easier than explaining that somewhere out there is someone who wrote the story of my night before I'd lived it, and that the last page was dated tomorrow, and that the sentence that ended it was not a threat exactly. It was a promise, and it was made with the calm confidence of someone who already knew it would be kept. I keep trying to find the right place to start this, and I keep landing in the same wrong spot. The dramatic part, the part that sounds like a horror story, the backyard at 3 in the morning, the eyes that didn't blink. But that's not actually where it started. That's just where I stopped being able to explain it away. Where it actually started was small. Where it actually started was a fork. My brother came back from his trip on a Sunday afternoon in August. 2 weeks alone at a cabin in the Cascades. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, the full disappearing act. He'd been running on empty for months, wrong kind of tired, the kind that sleep doesn't fix. And the trip had been his idea, his prescription for himself. When he pulled up to my place that evening, he looked genuinely better. Rested. Color in his face that hadn't been there in a while. I made dinner. We sat at the table like we'd done 1,000 times. He told me about the hikes, the silence, the way the stars looked from the porch without any light pollution. Everything sounded right. But at some point during dinner, he picked up his fork and something in me went very quiet. I can't fully explain this to people who haven't experienced it, and I've tried. It wasn't wrong in any way I could point to and name. He was holding a fork. That's all. But the way he held it was different from the way he'd held every fork at every meal I'd watched him eat for 34 years. Not dramatically different. Not holding it upside down different. Just a small, precise wrongness in the angle of the wrist, the placement of the fingers, the way the weight of it sat in his hand. The way a signature looks when someone practiced it until it was almost perfect but couldn't quite get the unconscious ease of the original. I told myself I was being strange. He'd been alone for 2 weeks. Recalibration. People come back from long solitary trips subtly off rhythm. I knew that. I let it go and we had a good evening and I drove home and went to bed. Except I didn't sleep. I lay there and I thought about the fork. And then I started thinking about other things from dinner. The way he'd laughed half a beat too late at something I said. Not a dramatic delay, not noticeable to anyone not looking for it. But there. The way he'd referred to a restaurant we'd gone to together 100 times and gotten the name slightly wrong. Not the wrong restaurant, just the name fractionally off, like a word in a language that isn't quite your first. I lay there cataloging these things in the dark, and then I told myself I was catastrophizing and I went to sleep. But the catalog kept growing. Every time I saw him that first month, something new. He called our mother Mom twice in one conversation. He has called her Ma since he learned to talk. 34 years of Ma, never once Mom, and now twice in 20 minutes, like the word had been swapped out of him and the replacement almost but not quite matched. He mispronounced the name of the town we grew up in. A town we'd lived in until our 20s, a name so worn into us it was less a word than a reflex. And when I corrected him he smiled and said right, of course, and moved on without any of the embarrassment a person feels when they've said something that should have been automatic. There was no embarrassment. That's the thing I kept snagging on. Every small wrongness was met with the same smooth recovery, like a program running a patch in real time. Normal people, when they make a strange error, mispronounce something they've known for decades, forget a restaurant name, call their mother by an unfamiliar word, have a moment. A flicker of confusion or self-correction or mild embarrassment. He had none of that. Every correction was absorbed instantly and without friction, like something that was very good at updating itself on the fly. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds and I am not a person given to dramatic conclusions. I'm an accountant. I spend my professional life in the precise territory of what can be verified and what cannot. I did not arrive at what I'm about to tell you easily or quickly. I arrived at it over weeks of careful, reluctant observation, and I arrived at it the way you arrive at a conclusion you've been trying to avoid, with a kind of exhausted certainty, the relief of finally just accepting what you already know. Something came back from that cabin in his car, and it was wearing him like a coat that didn't quite fit. The night I stopped being able to doubt, it was a Thursday, about 3 weeks after he'd returned. I was staying at his house, the guest room, nothing unusual. I got up around 3 for water and walked through the dark hallway to the kitchen, and something made me look out the back window. That instinct again, the one from the body, the one below thought. He was standing in the backyard, still facing away from the house, toward the back fence. No shirt despite the cold. Arms loose at his sides. I almost knocked on the glass to get his attention, almost. But something stopped me the same way something stopped me from opening that door the night I almost walked toward my grandfather's voice. I stood at the window instead and I watched him. He did not move. Not a shift of weight. Not a roll of the shoulders. Not the barely perceptible rise and fall of breathing visible in a back at 3 in the morning. 3 minutes I stood there. For the stillness was not the stillness of a person standing still. It was the stillness of something that had stopped performing the small unconscious movements that living bodies make because it had forgotten, in the dark, with no one watching, that it was supposed to. I went to the back door and opened it and said his name. He turned around. It was his face. Completely his face. Same features, same jaw, same eyes. He smiled. His smile. He said he just needed some air. Couldn't sleep. Everything was fine. Come inside, it's cold. Every word correct. Every word in his cadence and his register and his vocabulary. I stood there listening to him sound exactly like himself, and I watched his face while he talked. He did not blink. Not once. I stood there for close to a full minute, and he talked to me and smiled at me and did not blink even once. I went back to bed. I lay on my back in the dark, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about blinking. How often a person blinks. How automatic it is. How deeply and completely involuntary. Not something you can choose to suppress for an extended period without either tremendous practice or the simple fact of not needing to do it in the first place. I thought about what it would mean to not need to. What kind of thing would not need to? I've been living with this for 7 months. I see him regularly because to stop seeing him would require an explanation I don't have, and because, and this is the part one find most painful, the part one can barely look at directly, he is still, in many moments, entirely him. The laugh, the way he makes coffee, the specific cadence of how he tells a story. There are whole afternoons where I am sitting across from my brother and everything is right, and I think maybe I imagined it, maybe I catastrophized, maybe I am the thing that went wrong here and not him. And then he'll smile at the wrong moment, or absorb a correction too smoothly, Or I'll catch him in a room he thought was empty, and there will be a half-second before he hears me where the face is not doing anything at all. Not resting, not thinking, not existing in the idle expressive way that faces exist when their owners aren't thinking about them. Just blank, like a screen between frames. I don't know what to do with any of this. I've thought about telling his doctor, and I don't know how to do that. I've thought about telling my mother, and I can't. I've thought about confronting him directly, and when I imagine doing that, I imagine that thing in the backyard turning around to face me, and something about the way I picture its expression. Too composed, too ready, already knowing what I'm going to say, stops me every time. What I know is this. My brother went into those mountains, and something happened to him in that cabin. Whether what came back is wearing his body, or wearing his memory, or wearing something else, I don't have a word for. I don't know. I know it is very good at being him. I know it is getting better. I know that most people who meet it now would not notice anything wrong, and some days I wonder if I'm the last person who does. I wonder sometimes if it knows I notice, if it has known since the beginning, if the evenings that feel most normal, most like him, most like the 34 years of him I have in me like a language, are the evenings it is trying the hardest. That thought is the one I can't put down, that the closer it feels to him, the more effort something is making. And whatever is making that effort is not my brother. That's it for tonight. If these stories did what they were supposed to do, some part of you is going to hesitate before you turn the lights off. That's where we live. Right there in that hesitation, in the half-second before your hand finds the switch and the room goes dark and something that was invisible becomes possible. This is Black Fears. Subscribe if you're brave enough to come back. We'll be here waiting in the dark.